Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. My name is Brianna Griffith. And this week, I just want to once again remind people that Co-op membership drive is in full swing. This show originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, and has been on the air for a few years. And as with so many other news and public affairs shows based on this station, really offers a true perspective from the community and a true independent perspective on world political events that you will not find anywhere else. You certainly won't find that in corporate media. So if you have appreciated any of my commentary, any of the many guests I've brought in from across the world, I've had guests talking about sort of geopolitical situations from China, from Bali. I talked to someone from Venezuela, Paul Dobson of Venezuela Analysis. I talked to him the very month that the coup, the Trump administration's right-wing coup went down in that country. So I have truly brought sort of, when I say news and from the front lines of the struggle for social and economic justice, I really mean that news from the front lines of these global struggles. If you've appreciated that, the other news and public affairs program that community radio brings, I encourage you to go to koop.org right now and become a member. So that is once again, koop.org. Of course, I also want to give a shout out to the fact that this station or this show runs in New Orleans on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. And so I appreciate all community radio. And whenever WHIV has their membership drive, hopefully you will have a chance to help them as well whenever they have upcoming events and upcoming things. That's so crucially important to show that solidarity for community radio. And one other thing I would like to talk about before I get into the main story for today, I would like to first mention that basically there have been kind of political prisoners who have been arrested, or people who have been arrested and made political prisoners for organizing peaceful protests in Denver, Colorado. Over this past week, 5 people were rounded up in their homes on the street and in various places in essentially a police crackdown, an assault on the right to protest. And so, to get at the sort of gravity, I think I'm just going to actually read a statement from the main organization that was affected by essentially this fascist, this far right wing, this ultimate, if we want to go quote unquote authoritarian, if we want to talk about quote unquote authoritarianism, this is it. There's nothing like there's nothing as repressive as the U.S. police state anywhere in the world. And so I'm going to read, sort of a statement from the Party for Socialism and Liberation about what it is that went down in Denver, Colorado. So they, the kind of national organization says this. On September 17th in Denver, Colorado, law enforcement units arrested several lead organizers of the mass anti-racist protest movement that has been on the streets demanding justice for Elijah McClain and other victims of police brutality. This morning, this is as of last week, this morning, Russell Roosh was arrested in a parking lot at Home Depot. An hour later, 5 police cars surrounded and arrested Lillian House while she was driving. SWAT teams then arrived at Joel Northam's home and arrested him. And as we are writing, we have just learned that Eliza Lucero has been arrested. All 4 are members of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. There may be others who have been arrested, and we know since the publication of this statement that there are others who have been arrested. There was one more with a different organization. So they are facing multiple serious felony charges and many misdemeanors, including the bizarre and ludicrous charge of kidnapping, all because they have organized large Black Lives Matter protests. This is a major political attack on the whole movement and the PSL. This is talking about PSL here, will mount a mass campaign to defeat these phony charges and win their freedom. The movement for justice in the Denver area has in the streets constantly since the brutal murder of George Floyd and the release of the footage of the Aurora PD's murder of 23-year-old Elijah McClain has been in the streets. These organizers have worked closely with other activists and family members of local police brutality victims to amplify their cases. They have committed no crimes, but only devoted themselves to the struggle for justice. That is why they have been targeted and rounded up. The attack on the Denver anti-racist movement and the PSL is part of a concerted national assault on the Black Lives Matter movement, an attack driven directly from the White House, from governors' mansions, and from local police chiefs and police departments around the country. The military has admitted to attempting to use sound cannons and heat rays to disperse crowds on June 1st in Washington, D.C. Federal police broke the law by firing tear gas and smoke canisters with no warning. This type of repression is now being used in practically every city in the country to put down one of the largest protest movements in U.S. history. The Denver organizers could be any of us, and we all must stand together. We know that every social movement in the past has faced such repression, and we will stand up to face it again. We will fight, and we will win. And so that was an early statement that came out last week as of the arrest, I believe on Thursday, again, like the coordinated assault on peaceful protest organizers in Denver. So I just wanted to read that so that people are aware of it, and we'll continue to bring you that story as it unfolds. There have been 2 successive weekends, or there's this coming successive weekend of protests in Denver. There's a protest of solidarity in Dallas, and I'm sure there are others throughout the country, including LA and so many more. So yeah, that's what's going on sort of in the background. That I think is the longest introduction I've ever done. But I'm very glad to now bring on our main guest for this first segment. I'd like to talk especially about like kind of the effects of the hurricanes that have hit the Gulf, especially. There's one that just hit kind of Florida and whatnot. But there was also a hurricane earlier that hit Louisiana. The Louisiana governor had described it as, quote unquote, dodging a bullet. But in fact, it caused tremendous damage and actually impacted many, many people's lives, and is not getting the coverage, has not gotten the coverage that I think it absolutely deserves. And so to talk about all that, we are joined now by Caleb Granger, who's also an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the organization I was discussing earlier. Thank you very much, Caleb, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And also thanks for bearing with that very long intro as you as we led into this. So yeah, what was it? Can you basically give us the rundown of sort of like what it was like from your perspective? I know you have a lot of family, a lot of friends
Right.
in Southwest Louisiana. So yeah, what was that kind of like for you?
Well, what I was saying was there's a lot of people were not able to leave because there wasn't any transportation. They didn't have any transportation. The city wasn't really providing it. And then, as you were saying, the governor made his comment about we dodged a bullet. He was referring to the floods because it didn't flood like as it predicted. But a lot of people took his comment very offensively because their houses are completely gone. Currently, everyone in my family is outside of Lake Charles right now. They're all evacuated. My friends are over here in Houston, some of them, and then they're paying out of pocket for hotels because the hotel vouchers aren't really coming through. So it's really just it's a huge mess.
Yeah. Without a doubt. So, like, what sort of preparations were really done ahead of time? Like, how were sort of local and state authorities really kind of handling this, or not handling this, as the case too often is?
As far as I know, I wasn't there at the time, but it was just like 2 days before they were told it was, the word they used was that the storm was unsurvivable. So basically they said, get out. So everybody just left at one time. Everyone who could get out.
Yeah, everyone who could get out. I mean, I'm just gonna assume, I'm gonna guess that like no real public infrastructure is in place, like as far as
No.
yeah, there's nothing there to sort of like other than just get out. So that, like, that's great for people who have a car. That's great
Right.
for people who get on the roads first. But it seems like if you don't have a plan, like the interstates just get clogged up. And those, especially those who are the absolute poorest. I mean, where do you even go at that point, especially given
Right.
short notice?
Well, and then a lot of people who they went towards New Orleans, where they had if you stayed within the state, some places you got a voucher, but if you went to Texas, you didn't get a voucher because it wasn't through the state.
So if you go to Texas, if you try and take refuge, you don't get any sort of voucher for that.
Exactly.
And then I wonder, like, what sort of vouchers exactly is it? Is it just like they give you a little money to leave? They give you a little money to stay? Like, what's the deal there?
It's for certain hotels where you can stay.
Okay, so they just give you sort of they give you a hotel, but it has to be in Louisiana, the state that was hit most heavily by
well, because I'm not 100% sure on that, but I know from the people that I know that evacuated to Texas, they did not get a voucher. But people that I know that went to New Orleans, they did.
And is it kind of fully covering people? Like, do you get the sense from people you talk to, from friends and family, that this is actually like doing anything major to kind of change those circumstances?
I guess it's better than nothing. That's all I can say. I mean, it's I don't know how long it's supposed to last.
Yeah, so it's just so it's just kind of like it's very ad hoc. Then it sounds like what.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
How about federal response to this? Whether it's FEMA, whether it's Donald Trump, or whether it's anybody else. I know we were talking a little bit beforehand. What exactly has the federal government kind of done to step in and try and help out people?
That has been horrible, actually. Everyone that I know that has applied for FEMA assistance, they have been rejected, even if they did not have home insurance. Because originally they were saying that if you do have home insurance, then you will not get FEMA assistance. But I've talked to people who did not have it, and they still got rejected. So from the word is that FEMA is out of money. But, of course, I was actually reading that FEMA, some of their funds actually went to help build Donald Trump's wall.
As you were saying that, I kind of looked up, like, Trump, just typed in Trump FEMA wall. And, yeah, right. you can find those stories. Like, basically, that like what little, I mean, I'm thinking back, like we faced this problem over and over and over again. Like we faced FEMA being basically a completely incompetent force for providing any sort of real aid, since I mean, the most obvious example I think would be Katrina. But here it is again. Like it's been completely gutted. Like it's incredible to me, like thinking that like essentially we're now in the throes of climate change. These storms are getting stronger. These storms are coming more frequently. We had, I think, a record number of storms in the Gulf at one time, or the record number of storms in the Atlantic, and we now have so many storms that they have had to switch over to sort of using the Greek alphabet, because the entire the I guess Latin alphabet or whatnot had already been used up. They had already had their usual maximum number of storms, and so it's like the U.S. knows this is coming. The U.S. has the resources absolutely to deal with this. There's not a lack of wealth within this country, and yet it seems to be just a continuous, absolute lack of preparation and lack of willpower for anyone at any level, local, state, or federal, to really put the kind of funds into this and to really prioritize this in a meaningful way. They're just still doing it. It feels like just completely ad hoc to me.
Right. They just don't care.
So yeah, you said Trump actually also paid a visit to
Trump. Yeah, he went there. What he did was he was signing autographs, and he told people that they could sign the autograph, that they could sell the autograph for $10,000 on eBay. That was his response. And then as far as Joe Biden, I mean, I know he's not the president, but he didn't even bother to show up. He did like one tweet while the storm was coming, and that's all he did. And I know they say, well, he's not going to win Louisiana, so he doesn't care. But Gloria La Riva was here. She was there, and she brought food and water and for all the residents who couldn't evacuate. And she organized a protest in New Orleans for federal relief.
Yeah, Gloria La Riva being the presidential candidate.
Oh, yes. Party for Socialism and Liberation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to remind people who may not be familiar with that.
Right.
Gloria La Riva. Of course, we're told that there's no possible way that third-party candidates can ever make a difference, that we're throwing our vote away or whatnot. And what you're essentially saying is that, like, basically both of the presidential candidates and both of their parties essentially have completely abandoned Louisiana. I mean, Trump shows up, he signs autographs, he does the photo op thing, I think even worse than George Bush. But then Joe Biden, he sends out a single tweet because he decides he or someone in his camp decides that it doesn't mean that it's not important to try and win over Louisiana or whatnot, or otherwise just because Joe Biden hadn't left his basement for anything. The only time he's shown up for anything is the time he's been in any sort of public gathering whatsoever, or in any sort of campaign rally of any sort. Again, I'm not encouraging huge rallies, but he showed up to some far right wing Latino event in Florida where he played Despacito.
Yeah. I mean, I understand he's hiding from coronavirus, but what is he going to do when he's president? He'd have to come if he was.
Yeah, he'd have to do something. He'd have to at least, even if you can't physically be present at something for a million reasons, you can do something. And it's just I feel like neither president, neither presidential candidate, and neither party, again, we're talking the corporate parties here and their platforms, are even promising to do anything. So Louisiana, I mean, already suffers from kind of this, the widespread poverty caused by just the neoliberal gutting of the economy.
Right.
And on, on top of that, there's just a complete lack of, there's just complete lack of empathy, I think, from anyone. Well,
and there's a lot of environmental racism too. There's I don't know if you ever heard of a place called Mossville, but it's in Westlake, right by Lake Charles, and it's surrounded by about 14 different power plants or plants like oil refineries, and it has one of these plants actually blew. Well, it had a leak during the hurricane. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I didn't. I saw a little bit of the stuff, but I think unlike when I think the last hurricane hit Houston a couple years ago, I haven't heard that much about this. So yeah, what exactly is the situation there? Where?
It was just a leak. There was a plant that was leaking, and it was the air. They were telling people not to go outside who were still there because basically they didn't know if the air was even breathable, which it probably isn't breathable most of the time.
Yeah, and so they told people not to go outside. Did they give people a place to go? Did they?
Oh no, I mean, I guess they just meant stay in your house if you still have one.
So yeah. And if your house is underwater or if your house is destroyed or damaged, then what are you supposed to do? And the other part of that is the house is not going to have much better air quality overall.
Right.
Yeah. So it's just again, it's this sort of to me from what I see over and over again from all these state governors and from a lot of local officials as well, is this just telling everybody, hey, this is on you if you stay. If there's an unsurvivable storm, so if you stay and you die, that's your problem.
Right.
Here we've built all of these oil refineries in your community, so you should be happy that you have jobs. But when they leak and they make the air unbreathable and they make the water unswimmable, you just have to deal with that. It's all your problem. It's all on you. And it's no, these things have to be fixed at a systemic problem. I don't think that anyone within our government, again, at any level, federal, local, state, anything else, I don't think they really have the backbone or they really have the. I mean, they're just basically too in bed with, I think, the oil companies to even acknowledge there's a problem, much less actually start to fix these problems.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know we've kind of just covered a lot of ground. I feel like I've just sort of trashed
everybody.
Yeah.
Oh,
But yeah.
I would like to add that they added at like a 7 o'clock curfew, and apparently, I actually saw this on a video. There was a guy saying that he was out past 7, and he said that the National Guard shot at him. So
Jesus.
yeah,
So the National Guard are shooting people trying to survive
yeah,
the aftermath of a hurricane here.
yeah. I'm not sure if you saw the video. It was on the I saw the video. It was on Gloria La Riva, the video she put out while she was in Lake Charles, and he was talking about it. He said that they shot at him for being out past 7.
What do you think they're worried about? Like, why does the National Guard need to show up and make this an issue?
Well, I know what they'll say it is. They'll say, quote, looters. People that are just trying to survive, basically.
You know, again, like this idea that you should pay with your life for, again, quote unquote, looting,
Right.
like basically just this survival tactic when like society itself ceases to function, either in like, you know, long term, we're seeing some ceasing of functioning just because of like COVID and whatnot. But then like in a more immediate level, when society ceases to function in something like a hurricane, like, I mean, you have to get food somewhere. And if there's nobody
Right.
open to sell you the food, or if there's nothing open so that you can make the money to buy the food, etc., it becomes like this, like, you know, it becomes a personal imperative for you to find some way to survive. That's
Absolutely.
if you want to call that looting, I mean, you know, go for it. But it's not like it does like, this doesn't seem like a crime to me at all, just from any level.
No, absolutely not. And it also sounds like they're shooting first and asking questions later.
Oh, without a doubt. And I'm, yeah, I mean, that certainly seems to be the case with kind of U.S. repressive state forces, whether that's the police, military, whatnot. When they've decided that they're an occupying force in an area, that's what they do. Is they have decided that the people within that area are the enemy. And yeah, when you bring in a group of people who have been taught to act like they're an occupying force, and that the residents are their enemy there, I mean, you can't expect them to behave. I mean, you can't expect them to behave other ways. You can't
Right.
expect them to have humanity, but that wouldn't be the default. They're going to act like what they were trained. They're going to act like, you know, when you give them tanks, they're going to want to act like they like tank drivers and whatnot.
Right. Well, it actually reminds me a lot of during Katrina, when the New Orleans police, they actually they massacred a whole family on a bridge just for trying to leave the city.
Yeah, a whole family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's incredible, but you know, sadly, it's just. I mean, that's the state of things. I almost think like people need to realize that was a state of things pre-Trump. You know, because there's this idea that he's responsible for everything. For sure.
Yeah.
I
mean, he's responsible for a lot, but definitely not everything. He's the symptom.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I guess we have a couple minutes left. I'd like to, you know, I'd like to sort of ask you kind of what you see as the alternative to this. I mean, given that like basically we have no, like we've seen that like no kind of function of capitalist government can actually solve these issues, that no, or doesn't want to solve these issues, that they basically have all decided that they would rather leave people to die because it's more cost effective to just have people die off, you know, and engage in this sort of disaster capitalism. But this is not the way like society needs to work. This is not a natural like byproduct. What would actually a good, I think, like what would a real humanitarian response to all this look like? Like what really needs to be done when we hear something? I mean, you know, sure, there are all the things with global warming and whatnot of just like things that we need to fix there. But in terms of like actual hurricane response, what do you think like an adequate, like a real humanitarian response would look like, just starting from the second they know there's a hurricane coming?
Probably what it looks like in Cuba. Well, they always seem to be prepared, and they provide. No, they don't. They're not evicting people during the crisis. They're providing food, doctors. Basically, the opposite of what we're doing here.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's another thing. They were they eventually put a moratorium on evictions, but they were evicting people. They said if you weren't gonna, they said you still had to pay your rent during the while nobody was even there.
That's crazy. I mean, in the middle of a hurricane, or again, like right in the aftermath of a hurricane, and sort of evicting people for not being able to pay rent, even as like the entire economy is in just complete collapse. Absolutely absurd. And yeah, I think as we're talking about, like, this is a problem that really I think both parties are absolutely responsible for, that like essentially the U.S. capitalist system in general is responsible for.
Right.
Yeah. I just want to remind people that we were we've been talking with Caleb Granger, who's an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, about sort of the aftermath of the hurricane that hit Southwest Louisiana there. Thank you very much, Caleb, for coming on the show today.
All right.
Yeah, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. Welcome back to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, where we are currently having a membership drive to raise funds for the station that has allowed my show to flourish. So yeah, if you want to contribute, if you want to become a member, and I hope you do, please go to koop.org. And donate now. Again, that's koop.org. If you prefer to speak to a person, you can call 512-472-5667. That's 512-472-5667 to speak with someone, or again, koop.org. I would like, before we get into our second segment, this is a kind of multi-tiered show today for sure, because we're covering issues that I haven't had a chance to speak with someone about personally, but I want to cover, that need to be said. And so, before we get into kind of our last segment here, I'd like to once again bring another update as far as the anti-racist leaders who have been jailed in Denver. As of this recording, September 22nd, Liberation News, which is the newspaper for the Party for Socialism and Liberation, has released an article titled "Jail Denver Anti-Racist Leaders Subjected to Dangerous and Degrading Conditions in Custody." This is published by Ryan Hamby, who's one of the editors of Liberation News in Denver. This is an incredibly important article to read, especially when we just came off of Black August, when we talked about political prisoners and the importance of standing up for political prisoners. These are leaders in the anti-racist movement who were arrested at gunpoint, who were arrested in horrifying ways, and who were basically retaliated against by Denver area police departments for speaking out against police brutality, against the killing of Elijah McClain earlier this year. And so I just want to stress that they are still being held, that I'm going to continue speaking about this until they're held, that I hope others will continue to speak about this with me, that if you're a person of any sort of any sort of influence, or if you're a person with any sort of platform whatsoever, I hope that you too will take up this cause to listen to the stories of these political prisoners in Denver, to read about their struggles, and to do everything you can to draw attention to this crucial issue. Because, I mean, the very right to protest in this country right now is being challenged, is being attacked. And the fate of that right, the fate of the right to protest, the fate of the right to demand better conditions is so inextricably tied with getting the freedom of these people who fought so hard for these protests. Again, peaceful protesters. Not that I like that distinction, but ultimately, yes, they are peaceful protesters. They stood up for justice. and they are being retaliated against. And so I just want to once again draw people's attention to the Liberation News article titled "Jailed Denver Anti-Racist Leaders Subjected to Dangerous and Degrading Conditions in Custody." There's so much more that I don't have a whole lot of time to get into, but I just want to mention that if you go to liberationnews.org, you can find info about a petition demanding that the police drop all charges. You can find a fundraiser there for their defense effort, and you can find all of the information that the corporate media has so shamefully not covered in the way they should. So once again, you can find that information at liberationnews.org, and at the top of the page there's an urgent appeal. You can read more information there. But I also I want to pay tribute really to another hero in the struggle who passed away suddenly earlier this month on September 6, 2020. Kevin Zeese unexpectedly passed away. He seemed to die peacefully in his sleep at age 64. He was truly a leader of progressive resistance in the DC area, and throughout his life he was a person described as a truly loving man by those who knew him. I never got to meet Kevin Zeese personally. I don't want to speak too much about him that I can't say personally, but I did get to interview him once. I did get to speak with him, and he was truly a generous person to me. He was generous with his time. He was generous with his expertise. And he was someone who I very much hoped I would have many more chances to speak to. But I would like to also join so many progressive journalists in paying tribute by re-airing my speech, re-airing my interview with him. This was part of an earlier series that I had done with essentially an independent podcast outside of People's Republic. That covers more of a geopolitical ground that's very much grounded in sort of like looking at the bigger picture issues of global power confrontation. And so I talked with Kevin Zeese about the siege of the Venezuelan embassy that was led by essentially the far right-wing puppet of the Guaido, the quote-unquote government in exile there. Basically the far right-wing puppet that was controlled by Juan Guaido, oil companies, the Trump administration, and essentially the most reactionary people on the face of the planet. This siege on the Venezuelan embassy, where the Trump administration, Trump, Pence, Pompeo, and the whole lot decided that they had simply had enough of international law, and together with far right-wing, essentially the Venezuelan bourgeoisie, the Venezuelan kind of ruling class that has essentially taken up residence in DC, like basically the most bigoted people you ever meet, decided that they were going to besiege the people who were trying to protect the Venezuelan embassy. The Embassy Protection Collective, who had legal stewardship of this embassy in the sort of forced evacuation of the sitting diplomats there. There are a lot of international issues I don't want to get into too much because I want to focus on, and Kevin also gets into it though in this interview, but I want to focus really on just the highly reactionary nature and the sort of stage managed presence of essentially like these far right-wing Venezuelans who one day would show up screaming homophobic slurs, racist slurs, were calling black women monkeys, were throwing bananas at them, and were screaming that they were going to rape these women, threatening to rape the women who were, trying to defend international law here. And then the next day had the audacity, these same people, the same faces, the same crew of people who were assaulting these people would show up the next day with like a rainbow flag when the cameras were watching, and talk about how much they tried to claim to be the true Venezuelans and whatnot. And then as soon as the corporate media cameras would leave again, they would go back to again assaulting protesters and screaming at people, threatening to rape people, and preventing food, preventing medicine, preventing these necessary things from getting in to the Embassy Protection Collective. And yet throughout all of this, because I don't want this to be about them, I want this to be about Kevin and people like Kevin, who stood up for what was right, who stood up for democracy, who stood up for international law, who stood up for progressive administrations in the face of this vicious right-wing attack, and who, truly lived a life of principle, and who truly had a vision for what a better society could look like. So, rest in power, Kevin Zeese. I'm going to, again, air a selection of this interview. I hope you enjoy. I hope I haven't monologued too much, because I really want this to be about him. I'm wondering if we can actually start kind of near the beginning with sort of the breakdown of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Venezuela, and how the Embassy Protection Collective came to be.
We were actually in Venezuela when the U.S. Venezuela broke diplomatic relations, and Venezuela asked the U.S. diplomats to leave the country, and they did that after for a lot of reasons. But they basically found that the U.S. embassy in Venezuela was being used to organize a coup. They sought to undermine the election last May that was held when President Maduro won re-election. They tried to discourage people from running in that election because they knew that Maduro was going to win it, because he's popular and has been doing what he can to serve the people. And they tried to discourage candidates from running. They tried to discourage voters from voting. They've been trying to get the military members to switch and join the coup. They recruited Juan Guaido to be the so-called interim president. And so the embassy became not a diplomatic place, but a place for coup plotting and military attacks against Venezuela. So it finally broke, and diplomatic relations ended. And then when we came back to the United States, we learned that the U.S. government had allowed the coup plotters to take over the military attaché building in Washington, D.C., and take over the diplomatic offices at the UN of Venezuela. These coup plotters were able to take that over as well. These are really incredible violations of law, but that's the way the U.S. is when it comes to international law too often. And so the OAS then was manipulated in holding a vote in violation of its rules to recognize Guaido. They were unable to recognize Guaido based on their traditional rules. The Organization of American States is very much under the control of the United States, but they still could not get the 2/3 vote needed to recognize Guaido. So they changed the rules and required just a majority vote, and they barely got that. And the diplomats voting for it, looked very solemn when they did. They realized what this meant, how this just made the OAS look like a tool of the United States, and they were part of that tool, and it put them in position of, will our country be next? But they did it, and they ordered the Venezuelan diplomats to the OAS to leave the United States in 2 weeks. At that point, the next day, we came into the embassy. This is April 10th. And the Embassy Protection Collective began. There were still Venezuelan ambassadors, diplomats, and staff in the embassy for the first 2 weeks. During that time, we held forums every night on a wide range of issues, not just Venezuela, but Honduras, on AFRICOM, on CIA coups. We had John Kiriakou, a former CIA official, speaking about an insider's view of CIA coups from the Venezuelan embassy. Pretty amazing. And so we had like 100 people showing up every night. People started spending the night. We got to the point of something like 70 people sleeping over. The embassy staff building held up to 80 people. So we were even doubling up in rooms for sleeping. It was getting so popular and crowded. But then there was a coup in Venezuela, another attempt by Juan Guaido, where he tried to get the military to switch sides. He tried to go into a military base. The coup was quickly squashed. It was a very poorly planned and had little support, and so it failed very quickly. Then that day, coup supporters in Washington, D.C. started to come to the embassy. And that changed the whole tenor of the Embassy Protection Collective. We were under attack at that point, and an attack that built to maybe 50 to 100 people outside protesting us, threatening us, terrorizing us, using racist and homophobic comments and slurs, threatening sexual assaults against women, doing a cutthroat image of, we're going to kill you kind of image, banging on doors, breaking windows. They broke and entered into the building multiple times, were never arrested. It was like the Secret Service, which is responsible for protecting embassies, was using these pro-coup people to terrorize us in order to get us to leave voluntarily. Gradually, for various reasons, the number of people in the collective sleeping over shrunk because of health reasons or personal reasons or professional reasons or because of the terrorism. And we got down to something like 20 people. Then they cut off our electricity, cut off our water. They blocked food from getting in. And as a result, we shrunk to something like 15 people. And then when the water and the electricity really went off, we realized we had to conserve our resources. And so we shrunk to 7 people. Then the Secret Service threatened us with eviction. They put up these strange notices saying we were trespassing when we were actually legally with the permission of the Venezuelan embassy and the Venezuelan government. These notices were on just plain paper. No agency was described. No official from the U.S. government signed it. They cited a fictional ambassador, Carlos Vecchio, who was part of the coup, the failed coup, as saying that we were trespassing. I don't know how a fictional ambassador can say we're trespassing, but he did. And so this plain white paper with no identifying official characteristics was put up, and we were told to leave. The police then came and cut the chains on the front door that were put up by the Venezuelan embassy staff. 3 of the people who were with us decided they didn't want to risk arrest, so they left. It was down to 4 final embassy protectors. And we had a long conversation at that point with the police. They didn't enter the building. They opened the doors, and we warned them that crossing that threshold meant a violation of the Vienna Convention. We talked with them for about 45 minutes about the potential repercussions of that, meaning that if the U.S. undermined the Vienna Convention, that meant all embassies around the world were at risk, including U.S. embassies and U.S. personnel at those embassies. And if down the road they heard of U.S. personnel being hurt, kidnapped, killed, or an embassy being attacked, they should look back at this moment when they violated the law and entered this embassy as a cause of that attack and that injury. We talked about the potential of escalation of conflict between Venezuela and the United States, how this could lead to a military attack, how Venezuela is ready for a military attack. They had a very large military force of 200,000, but they also had 2 million of a people's militia, a civilian militia that was armed and trained and ready to defend their country. Plus, they were allied with Russia and China. They had air defense missiles to protect them from aerial attack. And this would be a very difficult war for the United States. That would be a quagmire that could cost trillions of dollars, just like the war in Iraq did. In fact, Venezuela is twice as big as Iraq, with 10 million more people than Iraq and better armed and ready than Iraq. Plus, they had Russia and China as allies, so it could become a global conflict. So we said, be very careful. You cross that threshold, you are leading to potential military attack, potential global conflict. You'll look back at history and tell your children that you broke the law, violated international law, and started the next global war. And we urge them to rethink this, turn around, go back to their superiors, and realize that there's an alternative way that's legal, and that's for there to be a mutual protecting power agreement between Venezuela and the United States, protecting the U.S. Embassy in Caracas and the Venezuelan Embassy in D.C. And that was the smart path to take. We urge them to go back and discuss this with their superiors. After some more discussion, they did do that. They left. They put handcuffs, those plastic handcuffs, around the outside of the door to keep them closed. They had officers stationed there. They said if we wanted to leave, just knock on the door and we'd be allowed to leave. We said we were staying until a mutual protecting power agreement was signed. And so the 2 days later, they came back just after breakfast with very little warning. They started to use a battering ram rather than cutting those plastic handcuffs. They used a battering ram to break into the building because they didn't have a key. They had 100 plus police, many in paramilitary gear. We always said we would not barricade ourselves in. That while we would not go voluntary. We would not resist arrest. So there's no need for this big show of force. When they came in, we said, we're on the second floor conference room waiting for you. And we waited. They came, they arrested us. And here we are now facing criminal charges, ready to defend ourselves in court. And so that's pretty much a summary of all that happened. Happy to go into more detail about any of that if you have questions about it.
To me, the kind of key moment that exposes that the U.S. knows how illegal this was, the key moment that knows that where the U.S. clearly knows that they have broken international law was when the police hesitated that night.
Right.
The fact that they hesitated, they turned back around and then came back with this kind of a militarized show of force. You said over 100 police officers in kind of full with assault rifles or whatnot, knowing full well it's not even a question, like, because the people who were in the embassy, you and the other people were taking selfies of yourself, so they knew who it was who was in the embassy. So
we weren't hiding, and we had written to them and said that we saw two paths for this to end. One was the mutual protecting power agreement, which I described. The other was for them to violate the Vienna Convention and enter illegally. They would be the ones breaking the law. We are there lawfully with the permission of the government of Venezuela. We're not trespassing. We're not unlawfully entering. They would be. And that if they did that, we would not barricade ourselves in, we said that we would not go voluntary, but we would not resist arrest. We were nonviolent protesters standing up for international law. So that there was no need for that show of force.
So with regard to the actual the international diplomatic implications here, is there any sort of precedent for a country essentially doing this to another embassy, essentially declaring, because they no longer like the other country's government, just saying that this embassy is no longer protected by international law according to them, and then just going in or essentially violating international law in that way? Because I can't think of as many, as people have pointed out, even during the height of, for instance, the Bay of Pigs invasion, even during the height of like U.S. Cuba tensions, no such violation of international law was committed in that particular way. No violation of the embassy was committed in that way. Can you think of any precedent for this?
Interestingly, the closest precedent is the Iranian Revolution, and the kind of shoe is on the other foot in that circumstance. Iranians went into the U.S. embassy, held U.S. personnel hostage, and in fact, the U.S. did challenge that in the International Court of Justice, which ruled against the United States, and it took years, but the U.S. didn't pursue the ruling because by that point the U.S. was encouraging the Iran-Iraq war, and the Iran-Contra issue was hot, and so they didn't want to pursue it. But that's the closest. Now, on the other hand, protecting power agreements, they're common. They've existed since the time of Genghis Khan. They were put into international law during the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s. They are now part of the Vienna Convention. There are 29 protecting power agreements currently in place. If you go to our website, popularresistance.org, the slider at the top of the page includes how you can help to demand a protecting power agreement for these embassies, the Caracas U.S. Embassy and the Venezuelan Embassy in Washington, D.C. We still see that as the ultimate solution. The U.S. needs to abide by international law and undo the damage it's done.
Presumably, I don't know if they've yet taken control of that embassy or not, but if they have, they cannot fulfill the diplomatic missions of an embassy. There's nothing that they, as this kind of puppet government that does not hold any land in Venezuela, that does not hold any position within the government, there's no possibility for them to fulfill any of the diplomatic missions, to my understanding, of an embassy anywhere. It's a complete farce.
No, this whole thing has been very much a through the looking glass, Alice in Wonderland kind of a moment, where a fictional ambassador of no government of a failed U.S. coup orders the United States to violate the Vienna Convention and enter the Venezuelan embassy illegally. is just like Alice in Wonderland. And then for the United States to seek permission for a protecting power for their embassy in Caracas from the Maduro government, while not recognizing the Maduro government, it's just like through the looking glass. It makes no sense. Now, you're right. Carlos Vecchio, who fled Venezuela because he was indicted for crimes that led to scores of deaths, inciting violence, and he fled Venezuela. He has no actual power as an ambassador, and he cannot fulfill any of the diplomatic functions that you would get in an embassy. So no Venezuelan can go to that embassy and ask Vecchio for a passport or a visa or any ability to go to Venezuela. Now, he was allowed to enter on Friday, and that was another major mistake by John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, further violating the Vienna Convention and international law. Vecchio, he's not really an ambassador. It's like he's playing one on U.S. media. I mean, the U.S. media has been absolutely terrible on covering this issue. You would think that this unique event in U.S. history, where U.S. citizens go into a foreign embassy to stop a U.S. coup, you would think that would get like daily coverage, day 1, day 2, day 3, up to day 37 when we were finally removed. But instead, we really had to rely on our independent media, Telesur, foreign media, and social media to get the message out. And thankfully, stations like shows like yours and others did cover this. And so I think a lot of people do know about it. But the misinformation in the corporate media and among politicians, even progressive politicians, has been pretty astounding. We avoided the term occupiers. We were not occupying the embassy like the Occupy movement occupied public space, in 2011. We were lawfully living in the embassy as interim embassy protectors while the mutual protecting power agreement could be negotiated. We were there lawfully, violating no laws. We were there with the permission of the democratically elected government of Venezuela, election that was held last May, where I was actually in Venezuela for that election and saw it happen. There were 150 official international election observers. I was not one of those. But I was there observing it for more of a media and reporting kind of role. But international election observers from all over the world were there, and they unanimously found that the requirements of democratic elections were met under international law, and that Maduro was reelected without fraud. He was legitimately elected. So yeah, we were lawfully present in the embassy. As I said, there was a election last May. 150 election observers unanimously found a legitimate election under international law principles for democratic elections. Maduro was reelected to a 6-year term, and he has a government, a foreign ministry, and his government's recognized under Venezuelan law and recognized by the United Nations. It is the legitimate government of Venezuela. And he won with 67% of the vote. His popularity has grown as he has fought back against this U.S. economic war, the illegal unilateral coercive measures, which we inappropriately call sanctions. But they are illegal under UN Charter and international law. And Maduro is the elected government and the recognized government, and we were there with their permission. So the foreign ministry applauded us for the work we were doing as protectors of the embassy. They thanked us. They offered all assistance that we wanted, and we didn't ask for anything, but they offered all assistance that we wanted. And they really appreciated that U.S. citizens would be willing to put themselves at risk for the Venezuelan people and for their independence and sovereignty, and to protect their embassy. When our electricity was turned off, as it reminded us of when we were in Venezuela and the U.S. had attacked the electric grid in Venezuela. When our food supply was blocked, it reminded us of the economic sanctions. When our water was cut off, it reminded us when Venezuelans lost water because they had no electricity, just as we lost water. And so we had a small taste of what the Venezuelan people are going through with the U.S. economic war and the U.S. Threats of military force when we were invaded by 100 police, including paramilitary troops. It reminded us of the threats made against the Venezuelan people by the U.S. government.
That was Kevin Zeese, the late Kevin Zeese, who I had spoken with last summer, I believe. I'm going to have to double check the date on that. Last summer, June of 2019, after, essentially the failed right-wing Venezuelan coup, the failed right-wing coup led by the Guaido and the Trump administration, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Elliot Abrams, and that whole crew of basically thieves. And so, I talked with Kevin Zeese about the Embassy Protection Collective that stood up for international law. Kevin Zeese passed away earlier this month on September 6th. And so I just wanted, while I could, to give a tribute to him and his work, along with so many others of those who have stood truly principled lives in support of democracy and support of progressivism, and who had visions for a better society. So thank you again, Kevin, for the one interview I ever got with you. Rest in power, and we will continue on your legacy as best we can to hope to fill those footsteps. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.